Well, okay. So we have started our discussion about the trend in historiography with the ancient historiography, that is Greek and Roman, and we have finished with the Greek and Roman historian like Herodotus, Thucydides, then Cato, Tacitus, Polybius, Livy. Now, after this early phase of history writing in Roman and Greek, there was a kind of dark period in Europe because of a lot of influence of superstitions. And history writing has receded back into the background. It was not given prominence. But in the medieval period, since from 7th century onwards, the people who have made a very significant, notable contribution to the history writing are Arab historian. And there are different reasons behind this trend. See, everything happens for reason. There are, we have already studied about the cause and effect, and then cause and effect and cause and effect, that cycle. The very important thing that has motivated the or created background for the Arab historiography is the rise of Islam. Before the rise of Islam, the Arab tribe were divided among themselves. They used to worship different gods and used to fight among themselves. But Islam, preached by Prophet Muhammad, has contributed as an unifying factor. And as now they are not wasting their energy in fighting among themselves, they become a very cohesive force and they started conquering other lands. Arab Empire immediately after that, after the unification, after the coming of Islam, immediately it started expanding in all direction. Not only Arab Empire, many people who were conquered by Arab, they accepted Islam and then they became Muslim. So in a way, it was a beginning might have been from Arab, but then later on it became a Islamic Empire. Now this unification, this spread of the Islamic Empire, it had definitely motivated the people that probably our society is doing a very great, remarkable thing like conquering far distance land, spreading of Islam. So we must keep an account of this, and that became one of the important factor that the Arab people they started writing down their history. Before that, the memories of the past were generally preserved in the oral form, in the oral ballad, as it was happening in the pre Herodotus day in Greece. Second thing is that as the these people, Arab Empire, as it started expanding in all direction, they came in contact with different culture, different language, and different intellectual tradition, and they were quite broad-minded, at least during some of the phase. What they started doing is that they started bringing those texts in different languages, learn those languages, and translate it into Arabic languages. Even when Arab they conquered Sindh, part of India, Indian subcontinent, they carried with them a certain text. Even the Arab merchants carried certain text, and which were later on translated into Arabic language. In Central Asia, at Baghdad, with the growth of Islamic Empire, they had a place called House of Wisdom, where these translators were employed, and the lot of text in different languages were translated into the Arabic language. And these Arab people, they wrote a different kind of history. Histories of countries that conquered by the Muslim. They wrote about the dynasty. They wrote about city. They wrote about biographies. And very important thing and very interesting thing what they have done is they have contributed to the travel writing. Now the thing that has motivated them to write travel writing is the tradition of Hajj pilgrimage. Hajj, going to Hajj is one of the important pillar of Islam. It is expected that a Muslim should sincerely try to go to Hajj at least once in his lifetime. Now, as Islam started spreading far away land like India from Central Asia, Indonesia, and so many places, going to Hajj from such a long distance, Hajj is in Arabic countries, and going to Hajj from such a long distance, was a very tedious, very risky journey. And many times people went after a lot of hardship. They did not come back. May some of them really died. But whoever can come back, as everybody was not in a position to go to Hajj during those days because of the expenditure involved and because of the life risk. They were very curious to know about what these people who went and came back have experienced. And the people who had been to Hajj, they started narrating their experiences. Now they slowly people thought ki instead of just narrating orally, why not to write it down? And that is how the trend of writing about the travel experience have been intensified. And now once people started traveling, see, if you are a traveler, you will develop an attitude of exploring new and new area, because that will enrich you one way or another. So many people, instead of going from their native place to Hajj, they started exploring the area far beyond. For example, Moroccan traveler Ibn Batuta, he traveled from Morocco to Hajj, and then further he developed a tendency to go beyond Hajj and come to India as well. And then he traveled further to China and some other areas. Well, now, apart from this, the chronicle writing and the history writing that started by Arab and then spread over all over those area where Islam has gone, or the Islam has established on a stronger footing, is the use of single era. Era is the way calendar, the way we count our years and days. They use the single era that is called Hijra era, and Hijra era starts on the day when Prophet Muhammad have migrated from Makkah to Medina. Now, as everybody use the same era, that is the same calendar, it becomes very easy to correlate. In contrast, you see what happened in India before the coming of Islam is that we had a different kind of calendars and people use it differently. We have Shak Samvat, we have, Vikram Samvat, and then we had this kind of thing. And then if you read a text, if you are used in a particular calendar Shak era, and if you read the Vikram Samvat, somebody has used the Vikram Samvat calendar in his writing, it becomes a bit confusing. And sometimes, converting those dates into the different calendar, it again becomes a very tedious, very taxing work, and people then they just skip it away. But having only one single calendar in whole Islamic world had facilitated the transformation of knowledge, understanding of the sequence of the historical event in a better fashion. For Muslim, there is only one scripture, that is Quran. Now everybody is, ideally speaking, everybody is expected to recite and if possible to by heart Quran. And most of the Muslim scholars, they started their scholarship from Quranic teaching. They will by heart, they will recite, and then on the same model they will continue to write history. They use the same vocabulary, they use the same pattern of language, they will use not same, if not exactly same, at least similar pattern of language, similar pattern of construction of sentences. And this has also again contributed to the growth of an exchange of knowledge. People started exchanging their knowledge, and then they started contributing history writing. Next important contribution is done by the idea of Khilafat. After the death of Prophet Muhammad, the person who became the spiritual as well as the political head of the Muslim were known as Khalifas. And Khalifa is considered to be the religious and political head of all the Muslims spread all over the world. And his kingdom is known as Khilafat. Now, though the proper Khilafat on which the Khalifa had his political hegemony or the political control was confined to the certain area, but the area beyond that, where there used to be the Muslim Sultan, he also pledge his allegiance to Khalifa, saying that I am ruling here as your deputy. For example, take the case of Sultan of Delhi. Delhi is far away from Central Asia, and but the Sultan of Delhi always felt it convenient. Not all, but many of them. They felt it convenient that you should take a letter of sanction from Khalifa that you are his deputy, because that integrated them with the greater Islamic world. and they had a psychological confidence that the whole Islamic world is standing behind them if somebody revolts in India or at any other place. So this feeling, psychological feeling that all the Muslims are part of the one Khilafat has also created a psychological bonding leading to the exchange of knowledge. And that is the reason we find that many historian of medieval period of India, they start their history from Khalifa and from Central Asia because culturally, religiously, linguistically, spiritually, they felt more connected with the Central Asia, and in a way that has contributed to the growth of Arabic historiography, because now people feel that they can freely exchange the idea. They had, in fact, they grew from one similar intellectual tradition started from Quran. Well, let me just take expansion. Well, now as the Arab Empire started growing, in the very initial phase, they conquered Persia. And Persia was a highly developed cultured society. We know it was having a great empire. Herodotus he wrote about the Persian and Greek wars. Now, as these Arab people they conquered Persia, they learned certain thing from Persian people. They borrowed certain thing from Persian intellectual tradition, and one of it was writing of history. And interestingly, the Persian historiographical tradition is influenced by the Greek historiographical tradition. So indirectly, Arab were also influenced by the Greek historical tradition through the medium of Persia. There is a book called Khudai Namak, which was in Persian basically, and it gives an account of the 100 king of Persia, and that was translated into Arabic language. And many Arab historians they got inspiration from that book. So in a way, Persian interaction has also contributed to the growth of Arab historiography. Next important thing that has contributed to the Arab historiography is their domination of trade. Arab is an area which is not a fertile area, and the Arab people has to mainly survive on the trade. And as they have to survive on trade, they started traveling to the distance part. They started mastering the sea. They became familiar with the change of the wind that they can use for traveling. And as you travel to the new area, as you encounter the new culture, definitely you will grow, and at the same time you will also feel like keeping an account. And we find that this Arab trader had also contributed to the history writing. Well, now, before we start discussing about the Arab historian, there are two, 3 points which are a significant feature of Arab history, and that is a very important thing is that it is called in Arabic ishnad. Ishnad means meticulous scrutiny of the sources and trying to go to the root of the information. Now, what does that mean? For example, by and large, we are familiar with Maratha history, and we generally read that when Afzal Khan and Shivaji met, it was Afzal Khan who first tried to kill Shivaji, and in retaliation, Shivaji killed Afzal Khan. Now, this is a general stand taken by the Maratha historian, but the Mughal historian they generally write that Shivaji was very clever. He trapped Afzal Khan in his sweet words, invited him to Pratapgarh, and then finally murdered him. So, who was a murderer? From the perspective of Maratha historian, Shivaji killing of Afzal Khan is a preemptive murder. That means Afzal Khan wanted to murder him, so in self-defense Shivaji killed him. But from Mughal historian perspective, it was Shivaji who was an initiator of conflict who trapped Afzal Khan and killed him. Now these two information definitely contradict each other. And now if I read now today history, for example, I'll read the book of let us say RC Benre, and then here I find this information. But I am curious, and then I want to know if Bendre writes that it was Afzal Khan who is the person who tried to kill Shivaji. I will try to find out from which source Bendre has found this information, and then I will try to find out which book he has referred to, and I will go and search that book, and that book might be a Bakar written, let us say, 200 years back. So I will try to find out that Bakar, try to get information. Then that Bakar mentions somebody else, that he is a person who has written this, and he had seen, he was there when all that event were happening. So I will go to that third source also and try to find out whether that person was actually there, or it is a kind of propaganda to enhance image of Chhatrapati Shivaji. This is called isnad. Isnad means when you find any important information, you go backward and backward and backward and try to reach to the source which is reliable and which was probably a contemporary source. To the extent it is possible. This is called isnad, and this is a very important contribution of Arab historian, and mainly the person who has done this is Ibn Khaldun. We will be talking in detail about Ibn Khaldun. We will be talking in detail about three important Arab historians: Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Batuta, and Al-Biruni. These three are the most important Arab historian that we will be discussing little in detail. Ibn Khaldun will discuss in somewhat more detail, and rest of the Arab historian I will just give a background, because Arab history is quite phenomenal. They have done a lot of writing. Next important contribution is travel writing. The Arab historian have made a very significant, very beautiful, very interesting travel account, and then they have also produced great philosopher like Ibn Khaldun, who had analyzed the science of culture, how the culture develops, what are the basic requirement behind the development of culture, how it declines as well. So there are different needs for the development of culture, material need, political institution, and this we will be discussing later on in detail. Now let us get into the little bit of overview of the Arab historian. The very early Arab historian that we find is Muhammad Ishaq, who died in 767 AD, and he wrote history of Umayyad dynasty. Umayyad dynasty were caliphs, and they were considered as the first great dynasty of caliphs. Then Ibn Hisham, he wrote the first biography of Muhammad Paigambar around 828 AD. Then in 8th century, as I told you, the Persian Book of King was translated into Arabian language, and Abu Ibn Yahya, he took inspiration from that, and then he wrote 33 books on the lives of the great people. Then there was a person called Al-Waqidi, who was from 760 to 837, and he was native of Medina, and in 8th and 9th century. And he writes about the spirit of Islam and military expedition. Then there was a person called Al-Madini, who died in 845, and he wrote number of books. He wrote about the conquest that Abu Bakr, the one of the great Khalifa, he made. Then Book of Khalifa. Then he also wrote on India, two monographs of in India. Then Tariq-e-Khulfa is also written by him. Then there was a person called Al-Baduri, who also writes about the spread of Islam to Syria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Spain. The European country was also conquered by Arab. Then Tabari, he write about history of prophet and king, and his book is can be called as a universal history. It talks about the world history. Then Al Masudi was one of the important historian. 36 book he has written, and it seems that he has studied the earlier Greek philosopher like Plato and Aristotle. Then Ibn Khali Khan, Obituaries of Eminent Man. He writes about the 900 great Muslim leader. It is the very earliest biographical work in the Arabic language. Then Rashid Alauddin, he wrote Jami ul Tariq, and that can be called as world history. So this is the kind of overview of the some of the Arab history. And now let us go to the some more important person from the Indian perspective, that is Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni was born in Iran, in fact, and he was carried hosted by Muhammad Ghazni. And Al-Biruni did not write only in Arabic; he used both the language, Arabic and Persian. Then he was captured by Muhammad Ghazni, and then later on, by impressed by his scholarship, he was employed in his court. So earlier work is surviving monument of past generation, but his work related to India is very important. Muhammad Ghazni came to India with a huge force, and Al-Biruni accompanied him. Muhammad Ghazni, he raided India, looted, and then went back with the wealth. But Al-Biruni, he stayed back in India for 13 years. He went to Banaras. He learned Sanskrit. He tried to understand what is written in the Hindu scriptures like Vedas and Upanishads, and then wrote his book called Kitab ul Hind, Book of India, that means. And this is a very valuable work about Arab historiography, where he writes about the Hindu mathematical system, Hindu philosophy, then astronomy, social system, about the caste system, and all that kind of stuff. And his observations are very minute. He says that presently Hindus are very proud, coincided, and they feel that there is no country like their country, there is no religion like their religion, and there is no king like their king, and they have nothing else to learn from anybody else. And he says that their ancestors were not so narrow-minded. Their ancestors that he could understood from the text like Rig Veda, they were much more broad-minded. They welcome the knowledge. But Hindus have become too proud of their tradition, and he says this much of proud is like foolishness. And he also writes about Hindus that folly is a disease for which there is no medicine. Foolishness is a disease, and we don't have any medicine for that. So that is a very interesting observation. But nevertheless, he did appreciate the Hindu tradition where it really deserved it. Then next important person in the Arab historiographical tradition is Ibn Battuta. He was an Arab traveler born at Morocco. Then he traveled to Hajj, and then from there he came to India. Then India, through all Central Asia like Egypt, Syria, Java. Then from India he went to the southern Indian part, and from there he went to Java, Sumatra, China also. So, when he came to India in 1300 and, 1334, it was Muhammad bin Tughlaq who was ruling over Delhi as a Sultan. And this Muhammad bin Tughlaq was quite impressed by Ibn Battuta's scholarship, and Ibn Battuta was appointed as Qazi. But later on, he became suspicious of, Ibn Battuta's activities. Muhammad bin Tughlaq was a kind of definitely an eccentric sultan. So Ibn Battuta was captured and put in the jail. But later on, those differences were resolved. Ibn Battuta was set free, and he was sent as an ambassador to China. But during his travel through the sea, his sea broke off, or everything was lost. Many people have died, but he could survive. But later on, he travels to China. Then he comes back to India. Then again through the land, he goes back to his place. And after going back to his place, he writes an account of his travel called Rihla. And in that Rela, he gives a lot of information about India. He talks about history, about the first Sultan Qutbuddin Aibak to Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and his observation about Muhammad bin Tughlaq is very important source in a sense because it is an independent observation. He was not no longer under the employment of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, so he was not under obligation to praise him. So whatever he has written, we can think that that is a bit reliable account. Well, and like Ibn Battuta, there were some more people who wrote travelogue. Like there was an Iranian naval officer. He wrote Chain of History and Wonder of India. Then Yakut, wrote geographical dictionaries. And now we are left with one historian, Ibn Khaldun, who needs a little bit detailed treatment, and that we will take up in the next class. So today we have discussed about the beginning of Arab historiography, what were the reason behind the Arab historiography, and what was, in a nutshell, in short, what was their contribution. Lastly, of course, we will sum up. We have discussed about the two historians mainly. We have also taken an overview nevertheless. We have discussed about the two important historians, that is Al-Biruni and Ibn Battuta. Ibn Khaldun we will take up in the next class. So if you are having any doubt so far, you can ask me.